Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. It has been a long time since we didn't have any webinars, but we are here back. Thank you for joining us. Inshallah, today you will get a lot of benefits. I'm really excited about this topic, which is risk assessment in the environment. And yeah, a quick update about our committee here in Oman. We would like to ask you to follow us in LinkedIn. We have 25 people, new people followed us, and we would like also to share with you all the informations in LinkedIn, so it will be easy for you to access. Yeah, because I think everyone is having LinkedIn these days. Yeah, so this is about the quick update about our branch. We are doing very great, Salaha. It's already half of the year and we are having a lot of people in the committee, and Mr. Ahmed Ayban, he's also part of our members, IIRSM member. And yeah, inshallah, we can start now our webinar. The mic is with you, Mr. Ayman.
Hello. Hello?
Yes, Mr. Ayman, we can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Assalamu alaikum, first of all, everyone.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you, Ashwaq and Julie, for organizing everything. Just a quick question. Ashwaq, everyone in attendees are members of the IIRSM, right?
Not all of them, really. We have new people.
Okay. Yeah. So do we have an idea about, let's say,
HSC?
Yeah, the background. Are they from HSC background? Are they most students? This would be quite helpful.
Hopefully, most of them they have a HSC background.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, I think we can. Are we good to proceed with the presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank the IIRSM and Ashwaq for arranging this. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Our presentation today is about risk assessment in the environment. Just for those specialized in HSC, it's not in the sense that we are going deeply into the environmental issues, but we are looking broadly at risk assessment as a concept and how we apply that when we use it in environmental risk assessments. Just a quick brief about myself. So I'm a member of the IIRSM recently. I've been working in the field of emergency response for the past 21 years. So I'm an engineer by education, and I have also masters in business administration, and I'm a member of multiple societies, and mostly in the emergency planning and response side. So just as a broad concept, I'm sure most of us, if we are in the HSC field, we know the difference between hazard and risk. But just for those who are not aware of it, and also to recap on our information, hazard is something which threatens our health and environment, whatever that is. There are multiple hazards in our daily environment. We deal with it on every day within our houses, when we go to our work, in the street, everywhere we are, there is a hazard, or multiple hazards, of course. Risk is a probability that an event or effect will occur, and usually this is the way we calculate risk, or at least identify risk, is by combining the possibility that the event occurs and its negative consequences. So we all take risks every day. When we go to work, when we do any activity, we take a risk. There is no such thing as zero risk. So risk exists no matter, as long as we exist, risk exists. So for example, we'll try to relate this to the health and environment side more, considering the current, I think for the past 2 years, we've all been living with the COVID-19 and all of these things that are coming up related to health. So, for example, what is the likelihood of someone's son or daughter picking up the flu, for example, if they get into contact with other sick kids in school? Or, for example, in our workplace, what is the likelihood of someone falling down the stairs if the stairs don't have a railing? I mean, obviously, those two, the risks are quite high. The likelihood are high because we don't have something to control it. We don't have control measures. And this is what we will be looking at now. So after identifying the hazard and the degree of risk, which we talked earlier about combining the likelihood and the consequence of a risk, it's important for us to carry out a risk evaluation. And from the risk evaluation, we are able to determine what precautions we should take. We should take to reduce the risk level. There are other items or other parameters that impact our risk assessment. For example, probability being the likelihood that a certain result will occur. So something, for example, if I fall from a stair that doesn't have a railing, for example, I'll have a broken bone. It's almost a certain result. Uncertainty is lack of precise knowledge, not knowing exactly certain parameters that would affect the final output of our risk assessment. Variability, there is individual variety between people. When we talk about people and the environment, there is variation between different human beings, variability between different living creatures, plants, so on. There are different responses to different events. So what is risk assessment in its broad sense? It's identifying the hazard in order for us to be able to calculate or ascertain the risk. And we use that to decide on what are actions to be taken to reduce the risks to the health and to the environment. So if we know the risks and their degree, of course, and the hazards leading to those risks, we are able to take certain measures. There is a hierarchy, of course, of elimination and so on, like different steps and different categories of how we could control risks. But anyway, from knowing the risks, we are able to decide on what measures to be taken to reduce such risks to the health and to the environment. So who uses risk assessments? Everyone, all of us. Even in our daily lives, we use it one way or another without knowing. In deciding whether, for example, to go out of the house on a trip when the weather is bad, especially in Oman when there is heavy rain, cyclones and so on, deciding before we embark on a journey if we will move or no by checking the weather forecast and taking the necessary steps before we leave is some sort of a risk assessment. Of course, there are certain authorities in Oman, particularly like the Ministry of Labor, Public Authority for Civil Defense and Ambulance, PACTA, Environment Agency, EA. Those undertake risk assessments. The Ministry of Labor, particularly in occupational health and safety, civil defense, everything that is related to fire and hazardous material risks, and of course the Environment Agency, looking broadly at environmental issues. Companies as well, PDO, oil companies, every employer actually should be carrying out risk assessments. And also when it comes to non-safety related matters, when they want to determine, for example, a product that if you can market it or sell it before you actually start manufacturing it. So it's also part of the process. So there is a general approach for risk assessment, which is a 5-step. I think everyone in HSE or with HSE background know those steps. Step number 1, identifying the hazards, and step number 2 is finding out or deciding who and how might get harmed. Like who, for example, if we talk about a plant with a release of gas, and then so we know that this gas has certain hazards or poses certain hazards to the workers. So the people within the plant would be the people at risk, and how they would be harmed. For example, asphyxiation would be here, how they would get harmed. Step number 3 is evaluating the risk, how the likelihood and the consequence, what would happen because of that, and the likelihood of this happening. And then we decide on the precautions. What do we do to control the risk? After that, recording the findings. It is a legal obligation to record risk assessments if you have more than 5 employees within the workplace. This is based on the UK standards, and also I think Oman adopts the same standards. So it is important to have a documented risk assessment. And then based on those findings of the risk assessment, we communicate them with the staff and with those stakeholders, those with concerned, and we, of course, discuss on how to implement them, and then we start with implementing them. And every now and then we have to review the risk assessment periodically, or if there is, for example, has been an incident where someone got hurt or a near miss. Sometimes some organizations revise their risk assessments if there was a near miss, an incident that was about to occur, or if something changes in the process of work or the location or so on. So this is generally the risk assessment steps. But when it comes to the environmental and health and environmental, there's some slight deviations. It's following the same concept generally, but we have some slight deviations. So for example, in the first phase, we do a problem formulation and scoping. We scope what are we doing the risk assessment for example, for a certain factory or a certain mine or a certain facility. We scope it, the scope of work, pretty much like in a normal risk assessment, like a safety risk assessment for a workplace. We scope the activity being assessed as well. Then we start by identification of the hazards, and then we look at every hazard, and we look at something called dose response assessment. We look at the response of people, or if we're looking at other living organisms, to the dose of the hazard. And then we look at exposure assessment based on the dose response assessment, and then we characterize the risk. And based on characterizing the risk, we come up with the risk management, for example, policies to respond to such risks. We will look into those steps further. So, as we said, the principal components of a risk assessment when it comes to the health and environment, we look at hazard identification, dose response evaluation, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. So, hazard identification, the first step. So, how do we do it? We ask ourselves, is there a hazard to begin with? And are we exposed to the hazard? So, if a hazard exists, this is the first question. Second is, are we exposed to that hazard? And also, what are the risks associated with the exposure? If I am exposed to that hazard, what happens to me? Okay, and of course, what is the likelihood of that hazardous event happening? So you might be exposed to a hazard, but then, you know, the hazardous event doesn't happen. And maybe during COVID-19, we heard about a lot of people who got into contact with people who were infected with COVID-19, but they didn't get sick. And this is the variability. This is the different response of different people. When we talk about human beings and living organisms, there's a lot of variability, and also there is no hard and solid rules sometimes. This is why risk assessment for the environment and health is a little bit more complicated than for safety. And then we look at what are the consequences and how much harm may occur to the person or creature or whatever subject of the risk assessment that we're considering if that hazardous event happens. So how do we identify a hazard? We recognize if it is a threat to our health. For example, homes that are in humid environments tend to have molds. After we finish, if you have any questions about terms or so on that you need them translated in Arabic, I am a bilingual speaker, so I can repeat the concepts or translate whatever is needed later on. So please take notes of any questions you have, and then we can discuss it later. A chemical, for example, in the drinking water, for example, if there is a factory that is known to have released some chemical into the drinking water reservoirs or drinking water supply, then that chemical is a hazard. Lead, for example, in older paints for how that we used in our houses used to have lead in them. So if we are renovating, for example, an old house that has been painted 30, 40 years ago, and we are having to renovate it, it's quite likely that the paint used in this house is contaminated with lead. And lead, of course, is a hazardous substance. We will discuss it later on. Hazard identification. So it is quite important for us to know the precautions that are taken. So for us to do those, usually we resort to two types of effects for the hazard. The first one is the animal models, actually animal testing, which is now a lot of people are, of course, working against. And of course, real life situations, actual studies on people who have been subjected to those hazards. For example, a certain village where a certain epidemic or disease or a certain phenomena has been observed, and studying those cases in real life would help us identify the hazard. The next step is dose response evaluation. So the type of hazard in our environment are mainly split into two main hazards. The first is physical hazards, like moving trucks, anything physical on the road, for example, and then chemical hazards. Chemical hazards in our households, cleaning detergents in our workplaces, or in the surrounding environment, being released from factories, from vehicles, from industrial facilities, all of that. So usually, the more we are exposed to a certain hazard, the higher the dose is, there is more risk to our health. So, for example, if I am, let's say, trying to cross a street with a single car passing, the risk of something happening is much smaller than me trying to cross it with more than one car speeding up on the highway. So there is more probability for something to happen. The same for chemical hazards. The higher the dose I am exposed to, the more likely the consequences will be, or at least that there is more risk to my health. So establishing the dose itself is one thing, the amount of exposure, but also the dose response. So what happens if what is the response of our bodies or the organisms to a certain dose? So sometimes a small amount that I'm exposed to over a longer term can cause the same effect as a large amount I'm exposed to over a short time. So also time and exposure amounts and limits are important to be taken into consideration. This is why also most of the occupational health and safety legislations or standards talk about dose versus time. They allow, for example, the permissible exposure limit for 30 minutes, for 60 minutes, and so on. So it has to be a factor of a quantity and time as well. So if we take an example, a little bit, let's say less formal, more casual, exposure to 3 types of chili. So classifying the chemical toxicity from those 3 types of chili. So for example, we have the habanero, and the jalapenos, and the red pepper. So if you see, it takes a lot of exposure quantity for the red pepper, much more than the habanero to cause a toxic response. So on the left-hand side, the habanero, with a small dose, it causes a high response, as opposed to the jalapeno and red pepper, which are have less potency. So if we take, for example, the chili peppers and we look at the curve of response, so the more quantity, the higher the dose, the more negative response we have. Also, we look at the chemicals now, because this is mainly one of the main concerns we have when we talk about health and environment, when we do risk assessments. Usually, I've been part of a lot of projects where we had to do environmental risk assessments, and chemical substances take a big portion of work. So we have two types of health effects from chemical substances. The first is non-carcinogen. Something that is not carcinogen means something that causes cancer or has the likelihood to cause cancer. So non-carcinogen chemical substances, we treat it below the point where the cancer may develop. I mean, we're looking at mostly at effects to the general health or skin, heart problems, diabetes, respiratory issues, asthma, and so on. And then we look at carcinogens, for example, like lead. Lead is a known carcinogen. There's a lot of things that are in our daily life that we come in contact with, unfortunately, that are carcinogens. Those are treated that they have negative risk because it has been established as but based on scientific evidence that it can cause or lead to cancer happening. And whether the metal or these chemical substance or so on is labeled today as carcinogen or non-carcinogen, this can change if there is new scientific evidence, if there is new legislation that wants it that decides that this should be, the label should be changed. So this is something we know. Those are revised based on scientific evidence usually to decide if the label carcinogen or non-carcinogen remains or changes. So if we take an example of a carcinogen, you cannot say that if someone is subjected or comes into contact with the carcinogen, we can say that there is a safe level of cancer. Cancer is cancer. It is unsafe. So, and usually if we increase the dose of the carcinogen we are exposed to, the risk increases. And mostly when we come to assess the risks from a carcinogen, we look at it in terms of how many people are in risk of getting, God forbid, the cancer out of 1 million people, or one, for example, like if you say I have one person in 1 million, it means the risk is much less than when you say that you have 1 people in 100. So this is how we look at risks when it comes to carcinogens. Okay, so if we look at exposure assessment, so now if we know the hazard itself and we want to know how can this hazard affect us. So exposure occurs when in one of those routes, whether it was touch or breathing it, eating it or drinking it, ingestion, inhalation, skin contact. Those are the routes of entry to the body or of exposure. So the principal component of exposure is we look at the degree of exposure or the amount. The degree is the amount of hazard. Degree of exposure is equivalent to the amount of hazard we're in contact with. Concentration of a chemical substance, for example. So if someone comes into contact with mold in houses, how much mold is in the house? What is the duration that the person has been in contact with it? Also, if someone is walking and there are multiple tripping hazards on his path, then the more tripping hazards, then the more exposure we have to this hazard, as well as the time, as we said, how long have we been inhaling a certain chemical, how much water or certain food we ate or drank, if this food or water is contaminated, and how many times, what is the frequency, how often do we drink it or eat it. Also, how much time, I think I said that earlier, how much time did we spend in the house with mold. All of this affects exposure. So exposure is a factor of 2 parameters. the degree or the volume or the amount of hazard, quantity, and the time that we spend with the hazard or we are exposed to such hazard. So the question here is, if we're exposed to a certain hazard, does it mean that we will be affected? The answer is not necessarily. I think I gave an example at the beginning about the COVID-19, and that coming into contact with someone having the COVID-19 does not necessarily mean that the person who comes into contact with them, even if they are not vaccinated, will get it. There is variability, there is individual variety. Response, response varies from one person to the other. So how do we evaluate the exposure? We look at the amount of chemical that we will be, for example, if it's a chemical, the amount of chemical that we'll be breathing, eating, drinking, or coming in contact with through our skins. So if we look at water, for example, a certain chemical in the water, the amount of that chemical in a certain sample. So it's usually we use the part per million as a measure, how many parts of that chemical per million parts of water are present, and what is the quantity that we ingested. Because if we know what is the volume of the water we ingested, and we know the concentration or the amount of chemical in that water, we can evaluate the exposure. And also if there's a certain gas that has adverse effects on the health that has been released to the air, if we look at the amount of air we breathe and the time, then we are able to identify the exposure. Again, the time, as we said, how much time we've been with the hazard, and again, looking at high-risk populations, children, elderly people, pregnant women, all of those are high-risk categories usually, whether it was an epidemic or exposure to a chemical or so on. Those have usually compromised, weakened immune systems. After that, we characterize the risk. So what is the characterization, or how do we characterize the risk? We can estimate how much risk a person may face. If we know information about the exposure to the hazard and how it could affect the health. So the exposure, the chemical or the biological substance someone has been exposed to, the duration, the quantity, and then the known hazards or known effects of that hazard on health. There are studies, if we look at chemicals, we usually check the safety data sheets, SDS, previously called MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet. We look at those, and usually they have information about the types of hazards and also the exposure limits, by the way, and the effects anticipated with every exposure limit. So sometimes we already know what happens. We know let's say the consequences, and in certain cases, for newly discovered chemicals, for newly discovered biological agents that were not studied enough before, then we have to go and do the certain studies to establish that. So, for example, if I'm in a workplace and the workplace is governed by the Ministry of Labor, occupational health and safety rules or laws, we have to look at how much, what is the exposure limit of the workers to that chemical within the workplace, according to the limits allowed by the Ministry of Labor, or in certain cases, certain chemicals or biological agents are regulated by the Environment Agency. For example, the amount of lead in drinking water. If it's higher than that allowed by the Environment Agency, then it means that we have a high risk. So what do we also consider when we implement the risk assessment steps? The first thing, we need to recognize the variability, the difference between people and the differences between where they live. So people living in the city are different than people living in a secluded village in the countryside. And also there's other things that come at play, like gender and so on. The difference between the exposure and the difference between the effects it manifests. Someone might get it, as we said, back to the COVID-19 example, someone might be, I know of a person personally that was within the same room, sleeping even within the same room with a brother who was infected with COVID. for 3-4 nights, and that person, the brother, did not get infected. Whereas within the same household, someone from the household got into contact with the sick person for a few minutes and they got extremely sick. So the fact that the exposure leads to a negative event is one thing, and also the extent of the negative event is another factor to consider. Uncertainty is lack of perfect knowledge. At first, when the COVID-19 happened, everyone thought it was transferred by touch via droplets, and then later on they discovered that it even gets transferred via aerosols in aerosol form, which changed completely everything we knew about it and how we responded to it. And also the uncertainty between the exact exposure. If we go back to the COVID-19, some people were estimating the amount of, let's say, virus in the air or so on that we get exposed to before we get sick. But also before conducting the studies, we were uncertain about this, and also how people respond to it. Some people, for example, there was a theory during COVID-19 that men were more at risk than women from the consequences of COVID. So while men got infected almost with the same rate as women, but men were more likely to experience negative consequences than women. This was one thing also that people were uncertain about. So how do we deal with the variability and uncertainty in risk assessment? So we try to collect as much data as possible. Statistical data is very important. The more we have, the more samples we have, the more representation of the population, the more representation of the group of people or group of things we are studying. And trying to identify all the people who have been exposed, chemical samples, or for example, in the case of COVID, biological samples being collected in different days, to try to see different days, different times of the day, from different locations, trying to identify as many characteristics as possible of a population that might be affected. For example, the lifestyles, people who are, for example, during COVID, the people who were active in sports were found somehow to be less vulnerable to COVID, statistically at least. So those all help us in establishing a pattern and understanding more about the variability and the uncertainty in the risk assessment process. So if we take an example to variability, it is known that cigarette smoking, which is a very, very bad, unhealthy habit, leads to cancer, developing of cancer. But as a fact, not all cigarette smokers develop cancer through their lifetime. Also, there are certain types of cancer that affect women more women than men, or the opposite. Some certain types of cancer that affect men more than women. Also, for example, the daily intake of certain things are different. Some people drink on a certain day 3-4 cups of coffee, and then the next day they drink none or one. So there is sometimes there is this kind of variability. There is no exact response or exact dosage for the same person sometimes, or for different types of people, whether by gender, by age, or so on. So we need to understand better how chemicals affect our health. So not all chemicals are thoroughly studied. There is a lot of chemicals that until today, we are still discovering more and more about the hazards they pose. And in many times, we don't have enough studies or knowledge about this, and trying to evaluate risks without this information lacks accuracy, lacks representation of the actual level of risk posed. Also, exposure to other hazards may increase the risk of certain health problems. So, for example, if someone is exposed to a certain chemical alone, there will be a certain health response. Maybe that chemical alone on its own will not affect our health negatively, but if we are exposed to a certain chemical plus another chemical at the same time, or in a short span of time between the two events of exposure, negative health effects happen. So let's try to put this into context to give some examples. So if we look at lead, it's a metal found naturally in the earth crust. This is a photo of the lead ore, like the raw material for lead when it comes from the ground. And looking at the health effects it slows mental and physical development for children, results in anemia, stomach problems, kidney damage, and assessing the risk that can lead the risks of lead, which can, for example, if you look at a house built before 1978 is most probably containing a paint that has lead in it. And houses built before 1986 may have plumbing, like the pipe systems might have lead. So this is, for example, to give us, if the house is built after those dates, then we expect to have less exposure to lead within the house. So how do we assess the risk from lead? For example, in such a case, we measure the lead in blood. This is one way to measure exposure by taking blood serum samples and detecting lead content in it. And then we have also, in such a case, a variability in the risk assessment. So the different exposure by different people. So people just staying at home, houses that are newly built without a lot of lead paints or so on, and that they don't go out much, they don't get exposed to much chemicals, are different than people who are working in a workplace which contains more lead containing objects. And also the different characteristics. If younger age students would be more susceptible, more at risk from being exposed to lead than, for example, the father. Uncertainty in risk assessment process can come from different things. The quantification of the effects, how to quantify it, and the genetics also. Genetics variability from one person to the other based on genetics and lifestyle really affects response. So how do we decrease, for example, this is as a control measure, how do we decrease exposure to lead? First of all, we need to know what may contain lead in our household. So surprisingly, lots of things. Candy, some natural ointments, those, for example, Axe, Abu Fas, those ointments sometimes contain them. Toys for kids, ceramics. In certain places in the world, like for example in the state of California in America, if you check any multivitamin or any supplement, it would say at the back, this supplement contains traces of lead or may have been exposed to something that contains traces of lead and so on. It's a legal obligation to inform the consumer that there is a certain amount of lead exposure there. I'm not so sure if this is also the case in Oman, but I have not seen it during my the past years. Drinking water also, there's lead released from factories and from industrial waste into the water streams, into the water network sometimes. Scary thing is also the toys. The older toys used to have lead traces. Hopefully now with inspection and monitoring, a lot of the toys making its way back to our kids are less exposed to lead, or hopefully without lead exposure. Cosmetics as well. Used by ladies are used to be a problematic area when it comes to lead exposure. So there's a lot of things that we come in contact with on our daily basis that have lead. So we as consumers need to be aware of this, and when we go next time to buy something from a shop, we try to read the labels and try to look and research and see if this product is containing lead or lead-free or so on. If we take another example, for example, falls in the workplace, falls in general can cause injuries. They can cause broken bones, they can cause sprains, they can cause, in worst cases, more severe injuries. So it's important to evaluate the risk of falls. For example, if we look at the home, I try to base the presentation generally on our households because I'm not sure of the backgrounds of our audience today. So I try to do it on a more general, more related, more relevant, let's say, application. at home. So the risk of falling at home, if we try to evaluate that risk, then we have to recognize that it's more dangerous for children and elderly people. Elderly people usually are, when they fall, the consequences are much more than the younger ones. Their bones are weaker. Calcium deficiency is a problem. It takes longer time for them to recover, plus a lot of things. Also, children are also at high risk of this. They are smaller, less able to deal with an emergency situation, so they are at high risk. So trying to evaluate the risk at home, we observe the area of interest, for example, the staircase, or let's say the entrance to the house, where there is, for example, a little bit protruding step, and observing those areas of interest and noting the areas where people can trip, slip, or fall, and what could happen after that. So our risk assessment in such a case would include our knowledge of the history and location of, for example, a certain hazard. Like if I have a pathway and there's like a protruding step where we have known historically that people tend to trip and fall on those, then this is one element to consider, the historical data. Variability in the risk assessment. So can come, for example, if someone passes through this pathway once or twice a day, they are less likely to notice it, and sometimes they forget, but at the same time they are less exposed to tripping on it. Whereas someone who passes frequently on the place, on that area, would have more knowledge of the area, might be more mindful of it, but at the same time they have more risk because of the number of passes they pass. Again, also the uncertainty in such a case for the risk assessment process can come from the effects that someone would have, would be posed on someone from the fall. As we said, someone who's elderly will be much more negatively affected than someone who's, let's say, well-built gentleman or lady in their 30s or so on. So what can we do to prevent falls? This is the control measure or mitigation measures. We remove things from the pathway. We try to remove things that pose a risk or a hazard, sorry. We remove things that can pose a hazard, a tripping hazard on the pathway. We make sure that the floors are not slippery, ensuring that the areas inside and outside are well lit. We have good lighting, especially the areas near the stairs. Having the handrails, for example, if we have a stairway on both sides, and to have some grab bars in the shower and tub areas. These are all control measures for reducing the risk of tripping or falling within the household. I am done with my slides for now. I hope I managed to cover the concepts I was trying to convey to you. I tried to make this as casual and less technical as possible, just to give the general idea, and also to show that there is a slightly different approach when it comes to evaluating risks from health and environmental perspective than the safety, the perspective which everyone almost is more aware of. So if you have any questions or so on, please let me know. I'm here to answer them. Ashwaq, I hand it back to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ayman. Julie, do you have any questions?
We don't have a question, but as we've been sent a statement, which I would be interested in your thoughts on. After finishing risk assessments, we should be doing inspections and auditing to make sure the process is going in the right way.
Yes, absolutely. It is absolutely correct. We have to also audit the methodology to know if the methodology that we are adapting in the risk assessment is suitable. Is it suitable for the types of risks that we are assessing, and so on. Yes, definitely, it's important also to check the steps, that everything has been taken into consideration, that everything has been documented, the basis on which we based our assessment of certain hazards and the responses to them. the currentness of how current and up to date is the studies we used, for example, to establish the effect of, let's say, lead on humans. So if we're using research from the 1970s and there's a newer research in 2020 that provides us with more evidence and more clear information, then auditing would expose such a shortcoming.
Great, thank you. We've had some really nice comments on your presentation. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's very informative.
Thank you.
Such a nice presentation. Proud to be part of this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Ayman. We really enjoyed the webinar. On behalf of my committee members, thank you for your presentation and for your time. I know you are busy and you give us your time for this. I hope all they enjoyed and get benefit from this webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
It's been my pleasure. I look forward to more events as a member now of the IIRSM. So,
yeah, for sure. Just a note for the audience that you will get your CPD certificate on your email, because we have a lot of people that come to our institute to ask about the CPD certificate, but no, just wait, you will get it through your email. Is that right, Judy? Yeah?
Yes, that's right. It should come out tomorrow, and I'll try and upload the presentation onto the IIRSM YouTube channel tomorrow as well, for those you may want to share it with colleagues.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Judy.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really informative presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I'd like to thank you for presenting. I'd like to thank everyone for their time this evening and wish you all a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.